It all started when I was eating a bowl of cereal and watching a squirrel juggle 3 acorns on my porch, and I thought that was the weirdest thing I'd see that day. 10 minutes later, I opened my front door and found a bright orange envelope taped to my mailbox. I hadn't ordered anything. It wasn't a delivery. It was a fine. A $500 fine. And the reason? Violation of HOA Ordinance 14.7b, unauthorized lawn art. The alleged culprit? My 6-inch garden gnome named Norman. That was the moment I realized 2 things. 1, I was living in a neighborhood run by lunatics, and 2, if they wanted lawn art, I was going to give them something they'd never forget. Something 12 feet tall, immortalized in steel, and modeled after the very Karen who signed the violation notice. They wanted war. I was more than ready. The neighborhood looked like a peaceful, suburban paradise. Freshly cut lawns, boxy mailboxes, pastel houses all arranged like they'd been copy-pasted from a real estate brochure. On the surface, it screamed harmony, but beneath it, the HOA ruled like a dictatorship disguised as a community committee. Karen Winslow was the self-appointed tyrant of this tiny kingdom. If the grass was too long, she fined you. If your curtains weren't neutral, she'd send a notice. And if you had anything that remotely suggested personality in your front yard, well, you were now the latest offender in her personal war against joy. I had moved into the neighborhood for peace and quiet. As a remote systems engineer, I valued calm. I didn't want drama. I didn't want noise. All I wanted was to enjoy the occasional glass of wine on my porch, while Norman stood guard in the flower bed next to my begonias. I picked Norman up at a flea market, tiny red hat, fishing rod, little grin. He wasn't hurting anyone. But apparently, in Karen's eyes, Norman was a threat to the moral fabric of our neighborhood. After the fine, I tried to take the high road. I marched over to the HOA office with the violation notice in hand and asked to speak with whoever filed it. Of course, it was Karen herself, sitting behind a fake mahogany desk with a smug look like she just solved world hunger by banning my gnome. She tilted her head, adjusted her pearl necklace and said, "I'm sorry, but we have rules here. This isn't a trailer park." That sentence could have ended wars if weaponized. I didn't even have time to respond before she dropped another bomb. Besides, lawn art invites rodents. You wouldn't want rats next to your home, would you? I walked out of that office feeling like I had just been gaslit into believing a ceramic gnome could summon a plague. I called my best friend Jess on the drive home. She was the kind of artist who welded sculptures out of junkyard scrap metal and occasionally set things on fire for fun. When I told her about the fine, she laughed so hard I had to put her on speaker. And when I mentioned that I was thinking of retaliating with something large, she got quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "How do you feel about steel and fiberglass?" That was the spark. That was the exact moment the plan started to form, not out of rage, but out of principle. If the HOA wanted to police personality, then I would deliver it on an epic scale. Karen said no lawn art? Fine. How about a lawn monument? A 12-foot-tall, hyper-detailed statue of Karen herself, complete with her signature frown, power walk, and clipboard of doom. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted art that could be seen from space. Of course, this needed to be more than just spite. It had to be technically legal. I spent 2 nights combing through every bylaw and clause in the HOA charter. I highlighted sections, took notes, even drew diagrams like I was studying for the bar exam. And that's when I found it. A small clause tucked between fence height restrictions and seasonal wreath guidelines. Temporary art installations not affixed to permanent structures may remain for up to 90 days, subject to review. It was enough. Just enough. And review didn't mean approval. It meant we'll get back to you, which meant I had a window. A very legal window. The next day, I went full blueprint mode. Jess was already sketching concept art. The statue would feature Karen Midscowl, holding a scroll titled HOA Citations, wearing a windbreaker embroidered with Neighborhood Watch, and standing on a base that read, in lawn we trust. We laughed so hard we nearly forgot the real stakes, but I hadn't. I knew this wasn't just a prank. This was about power. About fighting back against the absurd control these so-called community leaders used to stifle the very people they were meant to serve. Neighbors started hearing whispers of the plan. Some were skeptical, others inspired. A few even offered donations: cash, tools, materials. Apparently, Karen had been terrorizing people for years, but no one had dared fight back. A mailbox that was too non-standard? Fine. Christmas lights up past New Year's? Fine. One guy said he got fined for leaving his trash can out 30 minutes past collection time. This wasn't order, it was oppression. I kept a low profile for a few weeks, pretending to have backed off, playing the quiet citizen card. Karen seemed satisfied. She even waved at me one morning like she'd won. That only made me work harder. Jess began welding the internal frame in her studio. I built the fiberglass mold in my garage, section by section. It was grueling. Nights turned to early mornings. My arms ached. My tools overheated. I nearly dropped the headpiece down my basement stairs. But we kept going. 3 weeks before the installation, a neighbor from 3 houses down showed up with a wagon full of scrap metal and said, "For the cause." Another brought over old wire coat hangers. Someone else donated a mannequin arm. It became a movement, an underground rebellion fueled by lawn injustice and galvanized by one unkillable gnome. And all the while, Norman watched from his hiding spot inside my kitchen window. I had moved him there after the violation. Every morning, I'd give him a nod, a little silent promise. "They'll regret coming after you. They say revenge is a dish best served cold." But I was going to serve it welded, polished, and standing tall enough to cast a literal shadow over Karen's perfectly manicured lawn. Let's see what the HOA says about that. The plan was crazy. Ridiculous, even. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense in a twisted, poetic kind of way. If the HOA wanted to make a spectacle out of lawn art, then I was going to give them the Mona Lisa of petty revenge. Except bigger. And angrier. And with a clipboard. I called Jess that same night to finalize the details. She was already in the zone, talking about rebar density and load distribution like it was Christmas morning. "I want this thing to survive a tornado," she said between sips of her burnt coffee. "If Karen comes at it with a baseball bat, I want the bat to lose." We started by choosing the exact pose. It needed to be something unmistakably Karen. We went through photos, security footage, even a few digital reconstructions courtesy of a neighbor with a drone hobby and no fear. The final image was taken from a community town hall meeting 3 months back. Karen was standing in front of the HOA banner, pointing a bony finger at someone in the crowd while clutching a folder titled, "Compliance Violations." Her eyebrows were arched so high they practically touched her hairline. That was the moment. That was the stance. We were going to immortalize it in 12-foot glory. While Jess worked on the internal frame, I started gathering the outer materials. My garage looked like a scrapyard exploded. Sheets of fiberglass, chicken wire, leftover insulation foam, buckets of sealant, even an old wheelbarrow we sacrificed to build the hip. We worked late into the nights, blasting music and eating cold pizza off blueprints covered in notes like, "Increase Karen wrinkle depth," and "Make finger more accusatory." It was exhausting, but it was the most alive I'd felt in years. Legally, I knew I was on thin ice. That's why I consulted a lawyer, an old friend from college named Theo who specialized in creative loopholes. When I told him the plan, he laughed so hard he choked on his lunch. Then he said, "Okay, let's keep this fun but lawsuit-proof." We drafted a document naming the statue a temporary non-affixed community tribute, citing the HOA's own vague bylaws. It even included a clause that allowed uncommissioned art installations if not obstructing sidewalks or driveways and if erected for less than 90 days. Theo grinned like a man who'd just gotten paid to play Uno with the Constitution. "It's bulletproof," he said. Well, mostly. It won't survive an apocalypse, but it'll piss her off just enough to be worth it. With the legal safety net in place, I moved on to planning the logistics of delivery and installation. That part had to be flawless. If we fumbled the landing, Karen would find some loophole to shut it down. So I rented a flatbed trailer, bribed a guy with a forklift, and scheduled everything for a Monday morning at 6 a.m. The goal was simple: get it up before the HOA office opened. If the statue was standing by the time Karen had her first sip of overpriced latte, we'd win the first battle. As word spread through the neighborhood, the rebellion grew. People who had never spoken to each other before were now dropping by with tools, snacks, or just to sneak a peek at the creation taking shape in my garage. One guy brought over his kid's old tricycle for the base structure. "She fined me for leaving it in my yard," he said. "Now it's part of her but." The community, once silent under Karen's reign, was waking up, and it was glorious. The more we worked, the more absurd the statue became. The face was exaggerated just enough to toe the line between satire and likeness. Her expression screamed, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed in your entire existence." We gave her a laminated HOA rulebook, sculpted her signature windswept bob, and even mounted a motion-activated speaker inside the chest. When someone walked by, it would play a recording of Karen's real voice saying, "This is a violation notice," or "Please review your mailbox decor." It was creepy, hilarious, and oddly artistic. Jess said it belonged in a museum. I said it belonged on her lawn. Meanwhile, Karen had no idea. She thought she'd won. I caught her one afternoon talking to a neighbor, boasting about finally bringing order back to the neighborhood. She made some offhand comment about how certain people don't belong in communities like ours, and my blood boiled. This wasn't just about a gnome anymore. This was about a toxic power trip disguised as leadership. And I was about to break it with one giant statue. The weekend before installation, everything started falling into place. The head was complete, terrifying and magnificent. The arms were wired with internal LED strips for nighttime drama. The base was sturdy enough to survive a windstorm, thanks to Jess over-engineering everything like it was a military vehicle. We did a dry run in the backyard at 2 a.m., just to test the mounting and balance. It stood there, silhouetted by moonlight, looking like a giant librarian who just caught someone talking during reading hour. It was perfect. That Sunday night, I barely slept. Jess was already on site with the trailer and forklift, double-checking bolts and loading gear. At 5 a.m. sharp, we rolled out. The whole thing was wrapped in tarps and strapped tighter than a drum. As we turned onto my street, a few early risers peeked out their windows. I could see them mouthing, "Is that it?" followed by stunned grins. We parked in my front yard. The forklift rumbled to life, and at exactly 5:48 a.m., we began raising the statue. It took 20 minutes. 20 glorious, nerve-wracking minutes of steel and sweat. The sun began to rise just as the last bolts were locked in. We peeled back the tarp like it was unveiling the eighth wonder of the world. And there she was, Karen, in all her towering judgmental glory. Her shadow stretched across the street, pointing directly at the HOA office. The first person to see it was Mrs. Ralston, who lived across the street. She nearly dropped her coffee, then burst out laughing so loud it echoed. A minute later, Mr. Connors came out with his phone, recording everything like it was a parade. Soon, a crowd formed. People clapped. Someone played the 2001 Space Odyssey theme on their phone. It was chaos. It was beautiful. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Karen's Range Rover pulled up. She stepped out in her usual pastel tracksuit, sunglasses perched on her head, holding her reusable coffee cup like it contained the meaning of life. She turned to see what the crowd was staring at. Then she froze. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She took 3 steps forward, staring at the statue like it might come alive and fine her for breathing. Then she screamed. We had officially entered the next phase of the plan. And I hadn't even turned on the motion sensor yet. Karen's scream was something between a kettle boiling over and a hawk being electrocuted. It cut through the early morning air with such raw fury that even the birds went quiet. For a moment, the entire neighborhood froze. Everyone stared at her, then at the statue, then back to her, like we were watching a bizarre live performance of Karen versus Karen. Then, as if on cue, the motion sensor kicked in. A small speaker hidden in the statue's chest crackled to life and blared in Karen's actual voice. "This is a violation notice." The crowd gasped. Some clapped. Mrs. Ralston actually doubled over with laughter and had to clutch her walker to stay upright. Karen looked like someone had tasered her soul. Her eyes bulged, her jaw clenched, and for a terrifying moment, I thought she might charge the statue like a bull. Instead, she turned to me, pointed a trembling finger, and shouted, You think this is funny? You think this is acceptable?" I calmly sipped my coffee and said, "It's temporary art. Your own bylaws allow it." That only made her more furious. She stormed off toward the HOA office, muttering threats and demands into her phone like she was summoning a legal nuke. By noon, the footage had gone viral. Someone had live-streamed her reaction, and it hit Reddit like a tidal wave. Within hours, Karen Colossus trended under r/EntitledPeople, r/mildly infuriating, and even r/public freakout. Comments flooded in from all over the world, some praising the artistry, others offering to donate materials for future neighborhood tributes. My inbox exploded with interview requests. A local news van showed up and parked 3 houses down. A reporter tried to get a quote from Karen, but she slammed her door so hard the wreath fell off. Back at my house, the scene was borderline festive. Neighbors brought folding chairs, snacks, and even a portable speaker to blast dramatic music every time someone new approached the statue. One guy played Darth Vader's theme. Another brought his dog dressed in a mini Karen wig. Jess, who was busy making final welds to reinforce the statue's base, just laughed and said, "We've created a monster. A beautiful, bureaucratic monster." That night, I noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., my security camera picked up movement near the statue. I watched the footage in disbelief. Karen, wearing a hoodie and gloves, crept across my lawn with a flashlight and what appeared to be a crowbar. She scanned the yard like she was casing a bank, then marched up to the statue and took a swing. The clang echoed, followed by a string of muffled curses. The motion sensor went off again. "This is a violation notice!" the statue screamed, and Karen bolted like a cartoon villain, tripping over a sprinkler and disappearing into the darkness. I didn't post the footage right away. I wanted to be strategic. Instead, I printed a screenshot of her mid-swing and taped it to the statue's base with the caption, "Unauthorized maintenance attempt at 2:03 a.m. It was the first thing she saw the next morning. Her face turned 50 shades of crimson. She stormed off again, and this time, she didn't come back with threats. She came back with legal documents. A cease and desist letter was hand-delivered to my door that afternoon. It was from the HOA's official counsel, claiming the statue caused emotional distress, was deliberately provocative, and misrepresented a private citizen in a public setting. I responded with a scanned copy of the HOA bylaws, highlighted in neon, and added a note. Please refer to Clause 6.4 on temporary art installations. Looking forward to our 90 days together. Karen didn't take it well. That evening, she convened an emergency HOA meeting. Half the board didn't show up. The ones who did couldn't stop laughing when someone played the statue's soundbite every time she raised her voice. She tried to pass a new bylaw banning all front yard displays over 3 feet, but it didn't pass. The vote was split and one member abstained because, in his words, "This is the most entertainment we've had since the HOA potluck of 2018. The following morning, I woke up to a bizarre development. My mailbox had been moved. It was now lying on its side in the middle of my lawn. A clear intimidation tactic. Unfortunately for Karen, I had installed a camera right above it. The footage showed her dragging it with both hands, cursing under her breath, looking like someone auditioning for a role in a low-budget horror movie. I uploaded the footage anonymously to the same subreddit where the statue had gone viral. The title, HOA Karen Strikes Again, Mailbox Massacre at 3 a.m. The internet exploded. People started sending me 3D mock-ups of the statue, proposing t-shirts, mugs, even a bobblehead version. Jess loved the bobblehead idea. I was still weighing the ethics of it when the real bomb dropped. A letter from a local law firm announcing Karen had filed an official lawsuit against me. Grounds: defamation, emotional trauma, and property value sabotage. The documents were thick, dramatic, and sprinkled with phrases like gross caricature and intentional harassment through sculpture. Jess read the whole thing while eating cereal and said, "This is the dumbest masterpiece I've ever been part of. I'm so proud of us." But I wasn't worried. Not even a little. Because while Karen had been swinging crowbars and mailing threats, I'd been busy with my own legal team. Theo had assembled a file thicker than a phone book, filled with evidence of Karen's HOA abuse. Selective fines, unjustified citations, misuse of funds, illegal surveillance. I even had a signed witness statement from a neighbor she threatened over Halloween decorations. If she wanted war, I had the receipts. I filed a countersuit. Harassment, abuse of HOA power, retaliatory fines, and best of all, unlawful tampering with personal property. I submitted the footage of her late-night statue assault, the mailbox relocation, and the cease and desist scare tactic. Theo added a cherry on top. A motion to investigate the HOA board for mismanagement and potential financial misconduct. The court date was set. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation like it was the Super Bowl. People picked sides. Most were firmly team statue, but a few die-hard rule followers stuck with Karen, clinging to the dream of a lawn art-free utopia. Meanwhile, I added another plaque to the base of the statue that read, "Pending litigation for entertainment purposes only." The next day, a mysterious banner appeared across the street. It simply read, "Let art speak." No one admitted to hanging it, but I had my suspicions. The silent support was growing louder. Karen had gone from feared to ridiculed, from queen bee to walking meme. And the best part? We still had 62 days left on the bylaw clock. The statue stood tall. The neighborhood stood with it. And Karen, well, Karen stood at her window every morning, staring out at the towering monument to her own tyranny, wondering how a 6-inch gnome had led to her downfall. The courthouse was packed, not just with lawyers and officials, but with curious neighbors, local reporters, and even a group of college students filming a documentary titled Suburban Warfare: The Battle of the Lawn. I hadn't expected a crowd, but I should have. By now, the story had taken on a life of its own. Karen had turned a 6-inch gnome into a county-wide spectacle, and the 12-foot statue made sure no one could look away. I sat calmly at the plaintiff's table with Theo beside me, dressed like he was about to negotiate a merger, flipping through our file with the quiet confidence of a man who'd already won. Across from us sat Karen, dressed in a stiff lavender suit, lips pursed so tightly they looked vacuum-sealed. Her lawyer looked about as thrilled to be there as someone stuck at a root canal during a fire drill. The judge entered, an older man with a face like wet cement and a nameplate that read Judge Holloway. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the crowd, and said, "Let's keep this civil." No pun intended. That got a few snickers. Karen didn't smile. She launched into her opening statement with the kind of fury usually reserved for hostage negotiations. She claimed I had deliberately defamed her, that the statue mocked her in public, that I created an unsafe, hostile environment where she couldn't step outside without being ridiculed. Her voice cracked on the word, humiliated, and she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue like she was auditioning for a soap opera. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then it was Theo's turn. He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and said, "Your Honor, this isn't a case about defamation. This is a case about selective enforcement, abuse of authority, and one woman's campaign to rule a neighborhood like a tiny pastel dictatorship. He proceeded to lay out our defense like he was reading from a best-selling thriller. He detailed the HOA fines, the inconsistent citations, the mailbox incident, and the crowbar attack, which we played on video right there in court. The jury gasped. Karen's lawyer put his face in his hands. We brought in witnesses. Mr. Connors testified about the time he was fined for planting sunflowers instead of HOA-approved azaleas. Mrs. Ralston explained how Karen once threatened to report her for hosting a garage sale without proper signage. Jess even took the stand and spoke passionately about artistic expression, quoting Supreme Court rulings and referencing the community bylaws with a clarity that stunned everyone in the room. By the time Theo wrapped up, it wasn't just a defense, it was a takedown. Karen, for her part, didn't make it easy on herself. She took the stand and managed to dig her hole even deeper. She admitted to moving my mailbox, claiming it was blocking the HOA's aesthetic viewline. She tried to justify attacking the statue, saying it was provoking aggression, and that she feared it might come alive at night. That last comment caused an actual chuckle from the judge, who politely asked her to clarify whether she believed the statue was sentient. She backpedaled, flustered, but the damage was done. Her credibility had evaporated. The final nail came when Theo revealed a document most people in the room didn't know existed: Karen's HOA presidency renewal form, or rather, the lack of it. According to the HOA's own charter, the president must submit a renewal form and be re-elected every 2 years. Karen had never filed one. Her last term officially ended 8 months ago. Which meant she wasn't just acting out of line, she had no authority at all. Every citation, every fine, every notice she issued during that period was invalid. The courtroom went dead silent. Then murmurs erupted like popcorn kernels in a pan. Judge Holloway called for order, then leaned forward and asked Karen, point blank, if she had knowingly continued her role without proper re-election. Karen looked like a deer caught in a very public, very humiliating spotlight. She muttered something about tradition and nobody else wanting the job, but it was too late. The judge slammed the gavel. Case closed. My countersuit stood. Her claims were dismissed, and the HOA was officially on the hook for damages, legal fees, and a community-wide audit of its enforcement history. When the verdict was read, people actually cheered. The judge scolded them, but even he looked like he was holding back a grin. Karen stormed out of the courtroom before anyone could speak to her, her lawyer trailing behind her like a man whose life choices had finally caught up to him. I stood in the courthouse lobby surrounded by neighbors, reporters, and a film student asking if I'd be open to a Netflix docuseries. Jess handed me a celebratory coffee and said, "Justice tastes like hazelnut today." The fallout hit fast. Within 48 hours, 3 more HOA board members resigned. An emergency election was scheduled, and a temporary oversight committee was formed. Karen tried to rally a group to support her reinstatement, but the momentum had shifted. Nobody wanted the drama. Nobody wanted the fines. And most importantly, nobody wanted a 12-foot statue of themselves glaring down at their own driveway. Her power was gone. Her credibility was toast. And according to one well-placed source, she was looking to sell her house and start fresh, somewhere without creative neighbors. But the story didn't end there. A week after the court ruling, I got a letter from the city council. They wanted to buy the statue. Apparently, after going viral, it had become something of a local landmark. Tourists were showing up to take selfies. Local businesses were offering Karen Colossus-themed drinks and pastries. Even the art museum sent an inquiry. I was stunned. Something that started as a ridiculous act of defiance had become a symbol of community resilience, and very unexpectedly, a piece of public art. After discussing it with Jess, we agreed to donate the statue to the city under one condition. It had to be displayed with a plaque that told the whole story, including the original gnome that started it all. They agreed. A week later, the statue was relocated with full ceremony to a city park, where it now towers over a koi pond and a surprisingly tranquil rose garden. Norman the gnome was placed right at the statue's feet, holding a tiny sign that reads, "Guardian of the Lawn." As for me, life finally returned to normal. My yard bloomed with more color than ever. Neighbors stopped by just to chat. We held a block party where someone brought Karen-shaped piñatas. Even the new HOA president, a retired math teacher named Linda, came over with homemade cookies and a promise that under her watch, lawn art would be respected, not regulated. I still wake up sometimes and look out at the now empty spot where the statue stood, half expecting to see Karen marching down the street with a measuring tape and a clipboard. But all I see is peace. And maybe a kid riding past on a bike wearing a t-shirt that says, "Let art speak." Because in the end, it wasn't just about a statue. It was about standing up to nonsense, about using creativity to dismantle control, and about proving, once and for all, that you don't mess with a man's gnome without consequences. The neighborhood looked different now. Not in the obvious ways. Houses were still the same colors, the mailboxes still lined up like obedient little soldiers, and the grass still held that suburban uniformity we all pretended to love. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. People smiled more. Kids played in front yards without fear of fines. Neighbors who used to wave from a distance now walked over and talked for hours. There was a lightness, a freedom, like everyone had been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled. And somehow, it all traced back to a gnome, a grudge, and a statue no one would ever forget. I thought things would go quiet after the dust settled from the court case, but that was naive. The story refused to die. It grew legs, wings, and an engine. Articles kept popping up online. First local blogs, then bigger platforms. One headline read, "The Suburb That Fought Back with a 12-Foot Karen." Another ran a think piece on the art of petty justice, using my statue as the centerpiece. People started showing up just to see where it all began. They stood in my front yard, snapping photos of the spot the statue once stood, like it was hallowed ground. Some even asked for pictures with Norman, who had returned to his rightful place beside my begonias, now housed in a protective glass dome someone anonymously donated with a gold plaque that read, "The First Violation." A few weeks after the court victory, I got an email from a talent agency in Los Angeles. They wanted to talk about adapting the entire saga into a series. At first, I thought it was a scam. I even checked the email 3 times for typos or weird grammar. But the signature matched the agency, and their pitch was disturbingly accurate. They had bullet points outlining each episode, character arcs, and even a mock casting list. Karen was labeled as central antagonist with comedic timing and delusions of grandeur. Jess was the chaotic best friend with welding skills and zero filter. And me? The reluctant hero with a secret flair for strategic vengeance. I forwarded it to Jess, who called me 30 seconds later, screaming with laughter. While I was still processing the idea of becoming the fictionalized version of myself, the city held an official unveiling for the statue in its new home. They added benches, a small podium, and even a QR code that linked to a digital timeline of the entire incident. Kids took turns posing next to it. Seniors chuckled as they read the captions. There was a mural nearby, newly painted, showing Karen mid-screech, Norman triumphantly holding a banner that said, "Art wins." I gave a short speech, mostly thanking the neighbors who stood up, the artists who helped, and even, in a roundabout way, Karen, because without her, none of this would have happened. To everyone's surprise, Karen disappeared. Literally. One day she was there, the next she was gone. For sale sign up, curtains drawn, no farewell notice. Word on the street was she moved to a gated community 3 towns over, one with a notoriously strict HOA that made our former version look like a summer camp. Someone joked that she found her mothership. No one really missed her. Not even the few loyalists she had managed to hold on to. Once the lawsuits, the videos, and the statue happened, it was over for her reign. The clipboard was officially retired. The new HOA board, now chaired by Linda, ran things with sanity and transparency. They rewrote the most ridiculous parts of the bylaws and actually asked the community for input. Imagine that. Meetings were calm, decisions fair, and no one got fined for having a flamingo in their garden or wind chimes on their porch. Norman's revival sparked a trend. Within 2 months, the neighborhood had turned into an unofficial outdoor art gallery. There were painted birdhouses, mosaics made from bottle caps, and even a life-size dinosaur someone built out of recycled lawnmower parts. Instead of complaints, people complimented each other. The sense of freedom was infectious. Jess, of course, didn't stop. The success of the Karen statue boosted her career tenfold. She got commissions from other neighborhoods, cities, even a museum that wanted a Suburban Rebellion collection. She started calling herself the sculptor of civil disobedience. When she wasn't welding, she was giving interviews or attending art panels. She invited me to one in Austin where I accidentally ended up giving a TED-style talk titled Gnomes, Control, and the Power of Lawn Art. Still not sure how that happened, but the applause was real. One afternoon, months later, I found myself sitting on my porch, watching a group of kids reenact the original unveiling of the statue using cardboard and a wagon. They even made a mini Karen mask out of papier-mâché. I laughed until I had tears in my eyes. I thought back to the moment I first got that fine. I remembered the outrage, the disbelief, and the spark that came right after. It hadn't been about revenge, not really. It had been about setting things right, in the most unexpected, ridiculous, and perfect way possible. That evening, I got one last surprise. A man in a suit knocked on my door, briefcase in hand, business card crisp and glossy. He introduced himself as a representative from a television network. Apparently, the series pitch had gained traction, and they wanted to move forward. Real script, real actors, real production. He handed me a contract that I promised not to sign without reading, though I'll admit my fingers were twitching. The idea of sitting in a room full of writers while they debated who should play Karen on screen was just too good to resist. I stood in the yard after he left, looking at the now empty space where the statue once stood. It was just a patch of grass now, freshly trimmed, oddly peaceful. And yet, it still felt like something was there. Not the statue, but what it meant. A reminder that absurdity can be powerful, that art can fight back, and that sometimes the best way to deal with ridiculous rules is with an even more ridiculous response. So that was how it ended. With laughter, with legacy, and with Norman back where he belonged. No more fines. No more warnings. Just peace, creativity, and the knowledge that one little act of rebellion can echo far louder than any rulebook ever could. And as for Karen, wherever she ended up, I hope she finally found a lawn free of art, noise, and, most importantly, people like me. Because if she didn't, well, she might just find herself immortalized in steel again. Only this time, maybe with 2 clipboards. Just for symmetry.